better lighting in my study. Hi, everybody. Welcome to A Mighty Blaze. I'm Jenna Blum, one of the co-founders of The Blaze. And this evening, we are so privileged to have with us one of everybody's favorite writers, KRISTIN HANNAH. Welcome, KRISTIN. We're so happy to have you back.
Thank you. It's so great to be here. I'm thrilled.
No, good. I am so glad that we managed to capture you, and now we have you for the next 45 minutes. Everybody, think about your questions. Meanwhile, I just want to say thank you to our repeat offenders on The Blaze. If you are bringing your light to us, thank you for joining us again. For those of you who are new here coming to see KRISTIN, we are a team of about 35 creative professional volunteers. We started during COVID to link authors with their audiences when in-person book tours were canceled. And now we are still going strong, bringing you your favorite authors in your living rooms where you don't even have to wear pants. And you can find us on Facebook, on YouTube, on Twitter. We are ubiquitous. You can check out www.mightyblaze.com to see what our upcoming offerings are. So you will never have literary FOMO ever again. No mo FOMO, nobody likes that. And now I am going to introduce our guest who needs no introduction because I am classy like that. So KRISTIN, are you ready for your official bio?
Okay.
I could ask you to do your own bio. Do you want to do your own bio?
No.
Okay. No, nobody likes that either. So I would not enjoy doing that. I will simply read your bio for you. It's hard to read all your own accolades, especially when you are as accomplished as KRISTIN is. But this is the short version, believe it or not. KRISTIN HANNAH is the award-winning, best-selling, mega best-selling, I would add, author of more than 20 novels, including the international blockbuster The Nightingale, which was the Goodreads Best Historical Fiction Novel for 2015 and won the People's Choice Award for Best Fiction that year, was the Reese Witherspoon Book Club pick, the Best Book of the Year by Amazon, iTunes, BuzzFeed, The Wall Street Journal, Paste, and The Week. In 2018, her novel, The Great Alone, became an instant New York Times #1 bestseller and was named the Best Historical Novel of the Year by Goodreads. The Four Winds, which we talked about on Blaze, which I loved, was an instant New York Times, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and Indie Booksellers bestseller, Today Show, and Book of the Month. Both picked it and made it their club pick and named it the best book of 2021. And The Women, which we are here to discuss tonight. I can never hold this up the right way on this streaming platform. Was also an instant New York Times bestseller. Today, it is #1 book on Amazon and has been for a long time. I don't know if you knew that. And it's a Reddit book club pick. I don't even know how that happens, but there are like whole Reddit rabbit holes dedicated to you.
Really?
In a good way, in a not scary way. Yes. So. It's true. And I just have to say personally that every time I bragged to somebody this week that I was interviewing KRISTIN HANNAH about The Women, people said, oh my God, I loved, see? Oh my God, it's great upside down. It's great right side up. They said, I loved this book. I love all of her books, but I really, really loved this book. So we're really grateful to have you here to talk about The Women. And would you do us a favor and tell us, just give us the Reader's Digest condensed in your own words of what it's about?
This is, I guess, it's a novel that I've been wanting to write for a very, very long time. And it's kind of shining a light on the American nurses who served during the Vietnam War. And it was what they experienced when they went to war and their service, and the struggles and the challenges that they faced when they came home.
Yes, and it is kind of like a women's story behind the male story. Like we had seen Born on the 4th of July. We know about the things they carried. I studied that in college. You know, we love our Tim O'Brien, but nobody had ever written about the experience of the female combat nurse. Can you take us a little bit through the plot? Like, can you give us a thumbnail?
Sure. I mean, it was so interesting to me. I mean, you know, you and I have talked before, and I've spent probably the last 10 or 15 years really focused on writing books about lost women's historical stories where I've been specifically interested in stories where we pretty much know what the men were doing and are taught what the men were doing in school and in books and in movies. Whereas the women, you know, are just sort of invisible in the landscape. And the Vietnam War is sort of a perfect example of that. These women were over there. There were 10,000 that served in some capacity in the war in Vietnam, another 265,000 that were in the military at that time. And they just, were really forgotten by everybody. And it's interesting, as I've been on tour and talking to people who have read this book, meeting their children and the nurses and, the people that surround them, I'm seeing how much it means to them to be remembered. They're 70 and 80 years old now. And I think that's something that I have found as sort of a passion for the last decade, is that it is important to all of us to be remembered. It's important for all of us to show gratitude to others who sacrifice on our behalf, and to talk about women and women's stories so that the girls coming up behind us know the amazing resilience and grit and courage that women have shown throughout history, whether we have been acknowledged or not.
Beautiful answer. I've been thinking a lot about the resonance of the women in our particular political time, and I do want to ask you about that. I also am so endeared to the protagonist of this book, Frankie, who I think of, and she's very young. Like, how old is Frankie when she goes overseas?
21.
She's 21. And why does she do this?
Well, Frankie is very representative of a lot of the young women whose stories I read and whose stories I wanted to tell. And you think back to, these are women who came of age during the late 50s, at a time when, women's roles were very set in stone and expectations were very narrow. And a lot of them, like Frankie, were raised in households that were very proud of their World War II service. They were raised by the greatest generation. And so there was a lot of pride in World War II. And so many of these women, and my character Frankie included, really signed up to go to war to make their family proud, and out of a sense of patriotism. And it was a much different time in the world. I mean, at that particular moment, they were very scared of nuclear war, of course, and people were building bomb shelters, and there was a lot of support for this domino theory that if Vietnam fell to communism, all of Asia would go. And so there was a very sort of patriotic sense in the beginning. And of course, we all know that changed over time. And I was a kid, during the Vietnam era. And I remember so keenly how the vets were treated when they came home. And it was really sort of a shameful time in America in terms of the level of support and gratitude that the American people expressed to their soldiers. And as bad as it was for the men, and it was bad, it was even worse for the women, because nobody even knew that they had been there.
Yeah, that was very striking to me, that I knew from watching Born on the 4th of July that, and I knew this just from reading my own history, but I'd never experienced it firsthand. So I want to ask about that. But when the men came home, they were spat on and they were vilified and accused of being baby killers and so on, right? It's from reading the Tim O'Brien. What is your personal recollection of that? I'm really fascinated. Do you have one that stands out in particular?
Well, like I said, I was young. So I was 9 years old in 1969. And my best friend's father was a pilot who served in Vietnam, and he was shot down. And so I started wearing, we wore prisoner of war bracelets in those days, which had the serviceman's name and when he was shot down. And the idea was that we would wear these bracelets in remembrance until the soldier came home. And mine never did. He never did come home. And so for years, decades, I wore, this man who I'd never met, wore his name on my wrist. And so I was really cognizant of the men coming home. And I don't remember, you know, how badly they were treated, but I remember hearing about it as I was getting older. And so it just, I think really, it stayed with me, and I wanted to write this book for years. In fact, interestingly enough, I first pitched this book. I pitched a Vietnam era book in 1997. And my then editor said, who had been at Berkeley, by the way, in 1968, my editor. And she said, basically, KRISTIN, honey, you aren't old enough and you aren't good enough, and you need to wait until you are.
Whoa.
And yeah, and she was absolutely right. I was too young to have the historical perspective. I wasn't accomplished enough. I didn't have as strong a vision or voice as I do now. And so every couple of years I would think to myself, gosh, I wonder, am I old enough? Am I good enough? You know, can I write this book yet? And I think, well, it wasn't until March of 2020, actually. So I had finished, I just turned in the Four Winds, and we in Seattle were in lockdown. And I was trying to figure out, you know, what the next book would be. And to your point earlier, I'm watching the news and I'm seeing the country in such chaos, in such anger, so divided, so politically sort of broken. And I remember thinking to myself, boy, this feels like Vietnam again. And then I was watching our nurses who were on, and doctors who were on the front lines of the pandemic. And I could see how much they were sacrificing for us, and how often I felt that they weren't getting the support or the gratitude or the, I guess, support that they needed. And that's when it struck me that the Vietnam story is relevant again. And that's when I started it.
So that kind of rang a bell. Was there like a catalytic moment, or were you just, did you just have a feeling come over you like, now it's time to work on this?
I think there was both this light bulb moment of, because for years, of course, what everyone said was nobody wants to read about Vietnam. I'm sure you know other writers who have tried to sell books about Vietnam, and they keep hearing no one wants to read about it. And so I was very aware of that, obviously. But then I had this moment where I thought, okay, it's relevant. And I think anytime historical stories are relevant in the present, it's almost imperative to write them. I think, you know, that's important. And on top of that, I think there was a big part of, I was locked down, so I was trapped. And so I really had no excuse not to write this book that scared me.
Interesting. Why did it scare you? Because you had been told you couldn't write it, or because nobody wants to know about Vietnam? What was scary about it?
No, I mean, the scary thing was, this would have been this. I was very aware of two things: that I wasn't technically of the Vietnam generation. So I had not lived through it in the way that the people 10 and 15 years older than me had. And that I felt it was so important. And so I felt this obligation to be accurate, to be authentic, to be truthful. And you know, you're a historical novelist, trying to do all of that and tell an unputdownable story, and knowing that the people you're writing about will be reading it and judging it and telling their friends whether you were accurate or not. So that was all, you know, it was that whole, we were talking about it in the green room, the whole imposter syndrome of, can I really be good enough to write the book that I think needs to be written?
Yeah, no pressure though, right?
Yeah.
You want to create the memorable characters for your readers who feel like they're friends, who they carry around and remember forever. And then you know that you're representing actual experience. Even though it's fiction, it still stands on the bedrock of people's actual experiences.
Exactly.
I have a couple of small follow-up questions to what you said, and then I'm going to piggyback off the imposter syndrome and also talk more about the book. But one of them is, do you still have the bracelet? Do you still have the POW?
I do.
You have it with you?
No, I don't have it with me, unfortunately.
What was his name?
His name was Robert Welch. And, oops, sorry. And, oh, that's my husband's phone. Sorry.
Okay.
Live.
Men. Stop.
It's really interesting because when I finished this book and I went back to look at everybody and, write my acknowledgments and everything, I was really fascinated with him and his story. And so I went to the internet and, did a bunch of research. I found out that he had not come home. That was actually one of the first things I checked when the internet started in existence. I checked for him. But I actually did research and found his daughter, who had been my best friend in 1969, and she lives 5 miles from me. And so we ended up getting together and having coffee, and I had the break. It was just really amazing. And she, in fact, just went to Vietnam for the first time, looking for her dad just this year.
Oh my gosh. Did you cry? I'm just crying hearing this story. I'm a little bit like, oh my God.
Yeah, I cried all through the research of this book. I mean, there was just so many times because it was so powerful. And I think that's the thing, when you write about war, the stakes are so high, the sacrifices are so great, and the courage shown is so great. And I think all of it really, I don't know, it really impresses on me and reminds me that we as humans have so much more capacity for greatness than we often show on a daily basis.
We're not challenged in the ways that people in the book are, which is good, but also, yes, I think we need master storytellers, as somebody said in the chat, to help shine a light on those moments and those resilient abilities. Did your editor from Berkeley read this? And did she say, okay, I was right, and B, you have done it?
She actually did. And she is a very tough editor. And of course, I haven't worked with her for years and years now, but yeah, she wrote to me and said, good job, waited a long time, but you did a good job.
It's so great. It's like hearing from your 5th grade teacher who says,
I know,
you're a writer someday. And then you meet that person again when you're a writer, and it's like the most meaningful thing ever. Yeah. So she was right. That's a good editor. But I also think, judging from the reactions of people who I've talked to about this book and from reading it myself, I feel as though you have certainly succeeded in doing the nearly impossible, which is satisfying the Herculean task of pleasing the readers, pleasing the record, pleasing the history, describing things accurately, bringing things to light that people didn't know about. Do you feel satisfied with it?
I do, actually. I'm actually really proud of this book. I'm not necessarily proud of all of them because, they don't all end up being what you had in your head. There's what you imagine your book will be, and then there's what the book becomes, and then there's what the readers think of it. And they're almost 3, different versions. But this one, I really am proud of it. I'm proud of the story it tells. And I hope that it opens the door to other Vietnam era stories, because I think, I did a piece of it. I put all of it through nurses and their story, but I think there's so many other stories out there to be told.
I'm actually going to go off script a little bit on that note. One of my dear friends, Allison Richmond, who is a fantastic historical novelist who wrote The Lost Wife and many, many other novels, best-selling novels, is coming to have lunch with me tomorrow and hang out with me here in Boston. And she's watching this, and she knew I was going to interview you, and she sent in a question, which I will find. But it's about that very thing. It's about the sort of necessity of a time buffer. So here's Allie's question.
Okay.
My question is this. Do you think a certain amount of time needs to pass before readers are able to read a particular genre of historical fiction? For example, fiction that delved into the Holocaust didn't really begin until Sarah's Key and My Those Who Save Us, Allie's The Lost Wife were published in the early mid-2000s. And KRISTIN, like you, when I first started shopping my first book, which was about the Holocaust, I was told nobody wants to read about the Holocaust. That book is never going to sell, And I thought that can't possibly be true, but maybe there was a certain time buffer that needed to happen before people developed an appetite, and then maybe a sort of punch through the glass ceiling. So Ali's question said, we're now 50 years since the end of Vietnam. Do you think we need a time buffer like that in order to examine history with a cleaner lens? And maybe readers are more receptive to it because this is my addendum to Ali's elegant question, but maybe readers become conscious that something important is passing away and we need to embed it in our collective consciousness. Do you think that is true?
I mean, I think, it's like everything else in life and everything else in fiction. It depends. It depends on the book. It depends on the publisher. It depends on the people. It depends on the mood. But I will say that, like, I'm trying to think, I think I wrote The Nightingale. I think I was writing it in 2012.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember having the same sense that World War II and the rise of the right, the Nazis, felt relevant again worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do think there comes a moment where people are susceptible to hearing about something they think they know about through a lens of new information. And again, with regard to Alex, I know how incredibly talented she is. It's also about the gatekeepers. There are people, editors, agents, publishers, who decide what people want to read about based on limited information. I mean, you can't tell whether people want to read the women if they've never read anything like the women. So it's hard to know. But the bottom line is, regardless of how good you are, you have to get into the room to pitch your idea.
It really is a groundbreaking book. And I think your books have been so beloved to your readers. They have great track records. Like, you're in a position of authorial strength to be able to say, hey, I'm going to do something brave. But it also is in itself is a very raw and powerful book. I also think for writers who are aspiring and keep being told nobody wants to hear about this, nobody wants to hear about this, my advice is actually on the wall in my study. It's Winston Churchill's never give in, never give in, never give in. Like, if it's relevant to you and it is that powerful to you, I think that communicates to the readers. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And, the other lesson of the women, honestly, is sometimes when you're writing and sometimes when you're going forward, you hear what you innately know is very good advice, whether you want to hear it or not. And sometimes you do have to listen. I mean, I could have written the book in 1997. If I had wanted to, they would have published it. And I was lucky enough, to have somebody in my corner who I think saw a lot of potential in me and saw that I had a long way, yet to go to be able to write this kind of a book. And, the problem with books like this that you have in your heart for a long time, you only get the one shot.
Right.
So you really have to, you have to be able to swing for the fences and hit as hard as you can.
Yeah. With every book, you get only one shot. So it's an interesting. Hi, Ali. Thank you so much for the wonderful interview. We're so happy to see you. We have so many fantastic audience comments and questions, and I promise you guys I will let you get your at-bats. I just have several thousand more questions for Kristin first. But it sounds like there's kind of a synthesis between the writer's own belief in her own story and its importance, and then the understanding that, like, sometimes somebody else's advice chimes with you. And in my earlier days, I was terrible at that and very bullheaded and said, you don't want me to write this story? Great, I'm going to write it twice as hard, and I'm going to be up all night every night lobbing it into your inbox. But now I think it is true that if you're a little open to guidance, it's probably a good thing. I wonder, I've been thinking.
Also, let me just say really quickly, we also, especially with the internet and in the last few years, I was talking about this with a girlfriend recently, there's been kind of an evolution of this sisterhood of writers and a sharing of information. And it gives us there are so many more sources for us to go to find information out, where, you know, for years, my early part of my career, they kept you very isolated, and nobody got to know what anybody else was doing or making, or what was working or what wasn't. And that made it a lot easier to sort of keep you down. And the bottom line is, like you're saying, you have to make the decision, do I believe in this enough? And if I believe in it enough, I'm doing it regardless. But just make sure that you're listening to the smartest people in the room if you can.
Yeah, it's a great thing to have those people at the table. And I encourage all the aspiring writers out there and the readers to get in touch with the authors that you love. Kristen's like, do not do that. My inbox is exploding. But really, people are sometimes surprised that they can write to writers and we write back. But I love it. And we do have a great sisterhood of authors. We have a great sisterhood of editors and agents who I've been privileged to meet doing Blaze stuff. But, like, check this out. Actually, I wasn't going to. I just got a letter, like an honest to God letter addressed to my publisher from a reader in Oklahoma about one of my books. And I'm just like, I cherish this, you know, like this is on my laptop so I can write back to her with a pen tomorrow. So I think the community that you're talking about, as well as the belief, is so important, and about trusting your instincts about when to write what. I feel so fierce about this book. And guys, why do I keep doing this? I'm like holding it on my lap, and so it keeps reversing itself. But I feel very fierce about the women. If you haven't already read it, I know many of you have, but you should also buy at least 50 copies a piece to give out for Mother's Day. And just because it's a great book, just give it to everybody you love. But I feel so fierce about it. And I'm wondering, what do you think makes it particularly resonant right now in terms of our climate? And the thing that I think about the most reading this is, if I had read The Women 10 or 15 years ago, I would have had the feeling of like, this is a done deal. Thank you so much, brave women, for breaking this glass ceiling, being combat nurses, you know, becoming visible, having your stories told, just having the bravery to go where women had not gone before, and then raising your voices about it. But now we have arrived and we're equal citizens and everybody knows how accomplished we are. And now I'm reading it in an era where I feel as though in many ways women are being pushed back 50 or 60 years into very restrictive lifestyle boxes. And so I'm wondering if part of the great surge of passion behind this book is a reaction to that, to women saying like, yes, we did, and we still are. Like, can you speak to that a little bit?
You know, I think this book is, you know, usually a book hits on one or two levels. And I think this one has a couple of things in terms of what I'm hearing from, you know, women and from men and from, you know, readers in general. First of all, there is this, I guess, surge from the Vietnam era generation who are looking at their own life and their own past and their own behavior and reassessing it in light of facts that they didn't have at the time or things that they didn't know at the time. So there are a lot of women out there, for example, who were in college and getting married and having babies, and they weren't aware of all of this that was going on around them. There were the, you know, privileged people who didn't necessarily serve. There was just a lot of change going on. There were the protesters, there were the vets, you know, and all of these different stories. And like today, everyone only spoke to or knew the story of their circle, because it was such a divided time that, like now, nobody's crossing the aisle, nobody's talking, nobody's seeing the whole picture. So I think that's a huge part. I think the sisterhood that is at the heart of this novel is really powerful. This idea that these three women came together and they stayed together and supported each other for the whole of their lives, because I think we've reached this point where we are openly embracing sisterhood and ambition and choice and courage and all of these things as a group. Instead of when I was a young lawyer, it was very much woman against woman. And now it's woman with woman. So I think that's a big part of it. And then I think also finally, you know, the younger generation looking at this and realizing what all of this dissension and chaos and anger and the lying government, what that can lead to.
I hope people realize that. I heard you say a little bit earlier when you were locked down in 2020 and you were watching the news, and of course we all remember how apocalyptic it was. In fact, I actually don't remember it, a lot of it. I have blocked out large swaths of it, but every once in a while I revisit the journal I was keeping then, and I think, how did we even live through that? And it was not just the pandemic, it was the division. So you're watching the news and remarking not just upon the bravery of the responders, the medical responders, but on our political division. Did researching and writing The Women about a time when our country was so divided give you perspective on what we're going through now and what we are about to go through in this election cycle? And what are your feelings about that?
You know, I mean, that is such a broad and multi-layered question. I mean, the easy answer is that, like with the Four Winds, because as you remember, the Four Winds came out right in the pandemic, and it was about the Great Depression, and this one coming out, you know, during this political landscape. There's a comfort in realizing that there is an ebb and flow to history, and we can go this far off the rails and come back. So there is that kind of hope that we can get to a point where we are listening to each other again. It's still, I think it's as hard now to believe in as it felt in, you know, 1968, 69, 70. And it's a frightening thing because we have to. And so it's frightening. It's a frightening time right now.
I don't think that's an easy answer to the question. I think it's a hopeful answer to the question. And I think one of the great things about historical fiction is that it reminds us, as my Irish history teacher used to say in 7th grade, nothing's new under the sun. Never understood anything we were saying except that, you know, but I think that's true. And I think it's one reason that this particular historical fiction is resonating with people, is it does remind us the country was built on division in a sense, and continues to go through these sort of cycles. So I hope we can find our way back to each other. I'm going to give the mic to our audience in one moment. I have two questions, and one is, would you walk us through 2 days? And one is the typical day of the life of Frankie in the war, because I want your audience to know, if they haven't read the book yet, what kind of grit this young woman needed to endure what was a typical day for her. And keep in mind, this is somebody who arrived in Vietnam in a girdle. I mean, I have to put on Spanx when I go to an event, and it takes me like 4 hours and some Crisco to wiggle into that. And I'm like, oh, I can't breathe, you know. And so, like, to arrive somewhere like that hot, that humid, that fraught, and then, you know, where a girdle is only necessary maybe to bandage somebody up, right? So I would love to have you walk us through what one of her typical days is like, and then maybe what a typical KRISTIN Hannah day is like writing, because the audience always wants to know, how do you write? Like, what does your writing day look like? So first Frankie, and then KRISTIN, please.
Well, so Frankie, there's two versions of Frankie in this book. The first version of Frankie is, she's 21 years old. She's fresh out of college with a brand new shiny nursing degree and almost no actual experience nursing. She does 8 weeks of basic training, learning how to roll bandages and carry stretchers, and is told to wear a girdle and hose and heels, you know, to go to war, which she does. And then she ends up, you know, ultimately in a MASH unit, which is, you know, the casualties are coming in so fast and furious. And they're the kind of injuries that not only has she never seen, she has never imagined. You know, because you got to think of the era that, you know, the war movies she was watching growing up aren't the war movies that we are watching growing up in terms of the kind of injuries. And so she is just wildly unprepared emotionally and and with her skill set to be here. And so, you know, she is befriended by her two besties, Barb and Ethel, who have been there for 6 months and started out, you know, just like her 6 months ago, and now are hardened combat nurses. And so my favorite moment in the book is, you know, Frankie goes from, I need to leave, I have no business here, to doing a tracheotomy, or, you know, helping, you know, a surgery going during full mortar attack with the lights out on the floor with a flashlight in her mouth. And she just becomes really this kick-ass, you know, woman. And then ultimately, you know, she comes home to a world that will not accept that she has this experience, and puts her back in the, well, you're a nice 24-year-old nurse with very little hospital experience.
One of the reason I'm kind of like smirking and feeling proud of myself is that I dog ear the bottoms of the pages of books that I particularly love passages of. And one of the dog ears is about Frankie's nursing. And she has come home from the war, and she has terrible PTSD in a time when people don't treat that and denigrate it. They don't understand what it is. And especially for women, like, why would you have that? You were never in the war in the first place, right? But her friends come to her rescue, and they ask her, like, what will make you happy? And she says, nursing. She said softly. Damn right, Ethel said. You are a shit-kicking, take no prisoners, good nurse. You save lives, Frank. Think about that. And I loved that, because I feel as though for all of the PTSD that Frankie earns without knowing she's going to do it. I mean, now if you go into that kind of combat position, you have an understanding you're going to come out of it changed. It is irrevocable, but you didn't know that then. You would just go over with your girdle and think you were going to roll some bandages. And she literally slips and slides in blood all day long. And if she goes back to her bunk and there are rats there, that's like a good night, you know? So I mean, I don't know why are the rats, Kristin. Rats are very scary, but anyway.
Well, it's a tropical rainforest, Jenna. They're definitely gonna be there.
Yeah, they're gonna be eating the leftovers from them. Like, there is like nothing spared in this book, and that's exactly as it should be. But Frankie goes through this wormhole and comes out and has an identity. And I was so struck by the gifts that these sacrifices give us. And I thought that was such an amazing line. And the other thing, of course, that we all want to know is your day like this? Is it full of blood and rats and doctors and handsome doctors and napalm?
Yeah, no, not so much. Well, okay, so a typical day. First of all, I write longhand on yellow legal pads, and so I'm sitting in whatever chair I feel like. I can be on my deck, I can be in my backyard, I can be in my office, I can be in my bedroom, I can be on vacation in an airplane, wherever it is. And I just have, my special pen, and I write. And when I'm working, and I work sort of less now than I used to in the past, but when I'm working, I work pretty much from 8 to 4, 6 days a week. I have lunch with my husband. And other than that, I am writing, because honestly, mostly because I love writing more than anything else. And so when I'm working, I'm writing. And then I take long amounts of time, 2 or 3 months, and I don't write at all. I just read and relax and travel and sort of see people and build back up.
That's a really interesting thing to hear, because I also am a sort of feast or famine writer. I spent my December, January, February locked down and not really seeing people, doing some Blaze stuff, maybe hiking. But I was like, I have to get this out of my head while it's fresh. And I loved it. I love being in that zone. For me, it's much more rare than it might be for other writers. Like every 5 years I get in the zone, but when I'm in the zone, I'm in the zone. Do you ever get pushback from people who say, but you still have to have lunch?
I wrote my first book, my first published book, when my son was 2 years old. And so my first 3 books were written during nap time. And then I was writing school hours, school days. And I think one of the truths of being a working mother is there isn't time for everything. And so I chose writing a lot of the time because it was something I could do. I loved it. I could, do it at home alone. And the price for a lot of that was less travel, less lunches with girlfriends, less, going out and socializing. I did a lot less. And I think that's why I am so powerfully protective now of my downtime, where I'm not doing anything else but enjoying friends and family.
I have been very blessed with friends who I have trained over several decades to accept
Yes.
there are going to be times when I am going down into my rabbit hole. But I have lost friendships over that still grieves me. But I think it's a strange rhythm, the writer's life, in some ways. Like, you're really in magic land, then you're on tour, and then you need to recharge that battery. So I am gratified to hear you say that. We have about a jillion audience questions at least. So maybe we can do like a lightning round of audience questions. Like, I can't count how many questions we have right now. So Karen, our producer, pops one up. Did you watch the series in the 80s, China Beach? And if so, did it influence you writing The Women? Margie wants to know.
I did watch China Beach back in the 80s, and I loved it. I loved Dana Delaney. I loved everything about it. I think it perhaps influenced my writing in the sense that it made me aware of the nurses, and it furthered my my already keen interest in the war. It's a very different piece than I wanted to do. And I have to say, it's fascinating to me that as good as that show was, that there was never really another one, which I find shocking.
I bet there will be now. I'm going to ask a question that I bet is over there, but I haven't seen. Is there already talk about a movie or a series based on this book?
Yeah, Warner Brothers came after this book really fast. So fingers crossed. Yeah.
Smart. They would be so silly not to do that. I hope you're listening, Warner Brothers. So Anissa, one of our favorite people in the whole world, wants to know which character changed the most from the first draft to the final draft.
Well, I'm not going to give any spoilers away, but I can say that the biggest character arc change was in Rye, the pilot that Frankie falls in love with.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Now that I think about it. Ooh, okay. And those of you who read the book, you're like, whoa, you're right. Those who haven't, got to buy the book.
Well, there was a very different version of this book a year before, a very different version of this book. So his character always stayed the same.
I want to know the alt lives of the books. I wonder, do you ever share those? I see Margaret's question, but I'm just going to ask, do you ever share sort of like the drafts or outtakes anywhere where readers can see them?
No, because it's very common for me to throw away 200 or 300 pages, very common. And I always keep those because there's something in them that I really love. In this book, there was 300 pages. In The Four Winds, there was probably 400. Because I love that time period and I love the story, but it doesn't fit in this book. But then when I go back to it, and I don't know if you have this, Jenna, but having written it, I'm no longer interested in it.
Yes.
I have to follow the story and get to the end and see what happens. But once I do that, I think I don't really want to revisit that.
Yes, I do that with outlines. For about a year, I had 3 extremely detailed novel outlines on the wall of my study, and they were good books. And I was like, I can see how they would be a good book. And I sort of played some, passages from them on the sort of book piano, and then was like, nope. And then the book I'm working on now started to drag me around by the hair, and I am not capable of not writing it. Like, I have to write it because I'm in love with it.
That's exactly my process.
Yep. That is so fascinating. I think Margaret had a question that sort of pertains to this. Speaking of knowing when to write what, do you keep a list of settings and stories you're waiting foreground, and how do you choose the next project? Thank you.
I do not do any lists. I'm very much a theme-driven writer. So I'm looking for questions that I want answers, time periods that I want explored, that sort of thing. And so they stay in my head. Like, I wanted to write the Great Depression for a decade. I wanted to write Vietnam for 20 years. And then sometimes, a book like The Nightingale comes and says, I know you don't want to write World War II France, but you're going to. And so I just really, I'm like you, I follow the book that I can't not write. And I let go of all of the mini books that I think that would be a good book.
I have to say sometimes too, it is a pain in the neck to have a book announced.
Yes, it is.
Like that, because you think you know what you're going to do, and I have my calendar all planned out. I'm going to turn in X pages by X amount of time, and then the book goes boop, 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 boop. Excuse me, no, you're actually going to write this thing that makes no sense at all. And you're like, great. Actually, I have a question about that though. So you carry the periods in your head, the epics in your head of what you want to write. I do also. I've always wanted to write Prairie. I want to write Underground Railroad. I want to write, I have these big sort of diffuse themes and times that that almost feel like I have lived them in some way, but want to slide back into them. What turns the key in the ignition of the book for you? Is it the character? Is it like a snippet of a scene or a piece of dialogue or an image? We all have to start from some tiny thing.
It's interesting because when I take on, like, say, the Great Depression or even Vietnam, I make that decision. I'm doing the Great Depression. I'm doing Vietnam. I have no idea what the story is. It's the research then that tells me, what that story will be. It is rare to have a time and a setting that is so powerful in my mind that it supersedes story. And so, it's lucky to find that. I don't find it all the time.
So the research kind of affirms the story or gives you a key into that lock.
It just, at some point in the research, because I research books that I don't write all the time. And I, like you, I do outlines and, so I do the research. It becomes this where the research says to me, there's more to this story than you can imagine. And that's when I start, digging in deeper and deeper. And it's really important to me to find a really profound emotional connection with the people who lived during that era. Because I don't like, not all eras speak to me. And so when I start researching about, say, the nurses and what they're doing, I know that I could never do that, but I am mesmerized by the kind of woman who does do it. And that's, I guess, what I'm looking for.
That's really interesting. And then you create one who personifies that sort of experience. One of the things I love about Frankie is that she is sort of like an every girl. And then she becomes a sort of, I think, poster child for all of us who might have lived through that experience, give or take some personality quirks, right? So Amjad, and please, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I can't really tell, but I keep erasing the question too. Sorry, Karen, my producer wants to kill me now, but it's okay. Can you share your research process? Speaking of the research, and how long does it take? Do you back out of it sounds like you do the research before you start writing the book, and then mine it for the story and have research that doesn't lead to a book. But if it does, do you stay with the research and then start building the outline? Is it symbiotic? How does this work?
So initially, so let's just pick a time period. I start researching the Vietnam era. And, like the first couple of months, I'm researching the 1950s era of Vietnam. So I went all through the various time period so that I understood the history and what was going on. And I'm looking for, okay, where can I hang my hat? What's going on? And then I get to the war section, and it's just so visceral and it's so in your face, and the stakes are so high. The writer in me just is drawn to this. So then I begin to sort of craft my characters, bit by bit. And so it begins with reading hundreds of books and taking notes of everything that interests me, and then taking those notes and I guess organizing them and seeing if there's a natural story spine that my research leads me to. And so, for example, in the women, it was very obvious that the story here was about the the veteran, the soldiers who went to war and the veterans who came home. That gives me 2 parts of a book. And so I do that for about a year, usually. And then, of course, the book never is exactly what I expect it will be. So I'm also then continually researching for the next 2 years while I write it.
So you guys who are thinking, we just sit down on the top of our Snoopy dog houses and type out, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Like, that would be so great, but that is rarely the way it works. It is a lot of work.
Yes.
And I often think about that sort of process of drift. I was talking about this with a friend of mine who's a filmmaker this week, that there is the thing that you start out with, and then you sort of drift away a little bit in the process from what you thought you were going to be writing, and then you go back to it, and it's this very organic, a strangely organic process. I think we have time for a couple more questions. Christina wants to know, who are your favorite historical fiction authors? That is a great question.
Oh, gosh, so many. So let me think. Gabriel Marquez, Allison Richmond is one of my favorites. Christina Baker Klein, Jenna Blum. Let me think. Alison Hoffman, Pat Conroy. Those are just a few. Carlos Ruiz Zafón.
So many amazing historical fiction people. And I think about this now too, because World War II is also, like, people say, I'm so saturated with it, and yet endlessly, a topic.
It's always there. I know.
Right. So I think that all of the writers who are writing that time period, and now you have kind of broken the seal for Vietnam as well. Like, I am excited to see where that leads us. I'm also kind of horrified to know that the 1980s are now historical fiction.
Don't even get me started on this. I'm serious.
Younger than you are, and like, what are Ocean Pacific pants? And you're like, oh God, never mind. Just accept it. Don't ask the copy editor.
Well, when The Great Alone, which was set in like the 70s, late 70s, mid 70s, was up for Goodreads Best Historical Novel, I was stunned. I thought, is it a historical novel? I didn't think so, but I guess it is.
Right? You remember just sitting and eating your cereal in this historical era, I know, it's so funny. But I guess I think about this now, and I'm like, oh, remember the phones on the walls, the curly cords? Yeah, I remember. Okay. All right, I think our final question is going to be from our thoughtful bro, Mark Cecil, who just dropped his own book, Bunyan and Henry, 2 weeks ago. What is your dream reaction from a reader? What do you most hope readers feel or experience when reading your work? And before you answer that, I want to read something from the Washington Post that dovetails with this question. So thanks for the question, bro. Promise we'll get to it. And Karen, if you could leave it up, that would be great. But from your Post review, Kristin, the reviewer said, while the women destroyed me in a good way, it also awoke something that was and continues to be in short supply, empathy. It gives me a new appreciation for what everyday people from the past endured. It also gave me perspective for how my own micro tragedies fit into the larger framework of history. Hannah tells the stories of real but unsung heroes, and when you consider that, the price of a few sobs seems relatively small. And I loved this quote and this review because I think it encompasses so many things about your work, and I think that funnels into Mark's question. You write about women and their stories that people haven't seen, ergo the unsung heroes. You always write books about really big, important things. Like, you are always swinging for the fences with your books. The Great Depression, the Vietnam War. You're not writing about, like, oh, somebody popped a tire, right? Which is equally valid in some ways, the verisimilitude fiction, but still, you write about these hugely ambitious things. And that helps, like, put us in our own perspective. And with this great empathy, and you make us cry. And, on Book Talk during the pandemic, there was like this Colleen Hoover tsunami of tears where people were like weeping and reading Colleen Hoover and reading books and made them cry. It was like cry talk, And I wonder about the sort of aspiration of that for writers. I know when I'm working on my own books, I cry or laugh evilly or whatever. And if my reader doesn't do those things, then I have failed at my job. Like, do you aspire to have people feel this sort of big orchestrated feelings that are contained in your books? and what do you hope people really feel reading your book?
I mean, when I read Mark's question, the immediate answer to me was exactly what you read from the post. And the answer is empathy. I mean, I think that one of the great gifts of historical fiction, and this comes back to what we were talking about earlier, and all fiction, in fact, is its ability to put you in the shoes of the other and to make you understand a world or a feeling or a threat or a choice that you would never come across in your own life. And you might think that you know what it feels like to try to keep your child alive during the war, or to, work in a hospital, whatever it is. It allows you this empathy and this understanding. And I think that more than anything else is what is missing in our world right now, this ability to come together, to understand one another. And in fact, I did one of these talks a couple of weeks ago with a woman in London, I believe she was. And she was telling me how the women spoke to her so deeply because she had been a nurse during the AIDS crisis. And she said that they felt as invisible, as isolated, as ostracized as, the Vietnam nurses. And so it brings this whole conversation, A, about nursing, B, about women being lost, but also think about how you treat other people. Think about how you think about other people. And so that is, to me, the most important thing, is that I create characters that are powerful enough and memorable enough and authentic enough that the reader feels, I know this person, and by knowing this person, I am slightly changed, and my world is slightly expanded. And then the writer in me wants a book you can't put down.
Absolutely. Never give anybody a chance to go to the bathroom, cook dinner, or watch.
That's right.
Like, they have to be glued to the book. I was absolutely glued to the women. I held it upright this time. So I am learning. I know, it's great. This is a really wonderful book. I really did read it in a sitting. And there are a couple of pages in here I could show you that are cratered with like salt from tears. Like, I really cried into the book. So you definitely have inspired that empathy. We all have a lot of questioning of ourselves to do as we go into the next several months. I include myself in that category. Be kind to each other, read a lot of books, start by reading the women, give it to everybody you know. KRISTIN, thank you so much for the privilege of your time and your own empathy and your wonderful presence this evening, and for your books. We so appreciate you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. It's great to talk to you again, Jenna.
Oh my gosh. Write another book so you can come back.
Okay.
Do that. We cannot wait. Everybody, thank you so much for spending part of your Friday evening with us. Have a great weekend. Read well. Thank you, and see you next time. Bye.